in Abinitio, right? So we have a series of videos, right, to talk about micrograph. We will talk about introduction today, and then in following videos, I am going to talk about how we create the micrograph, okay, and how we deploy the micrograph into the uh, production system or into the higher environment, and then what are the different restrictions in micrograph, and what are the different examples of the micrograph, and how in web services processing micrographs are used actually. Okay, so let's talk about the introduction of the micrographs. So we have seen the different type of graphs like batch graphs, continuous graph. Within continuous graph we have seen continuous recoverable graph, continuous non-recoverable graph, right? In that series we have one kind of other graph which is called micrographs. So um, in graph settings, when you set up the batch graph, micrograph, and continuous graph, right? There also we have one checkbox which is called micrograph. If some graphs we are going to create and we think that this we are creating a micrograph, then you can indicate there in the graph settings that this is a micrograph. Okay, so and right, so what are those micrographs? These are the small tiny graphs, okay, small single processing graph basically. It's a kind of batch graph, it's not a continuous graph, but they are being used as a in combination of the continuous graph, outside the continuous graph. So outside continuous graph, which is a web service graph, and through the run micrograph component, there is a component called run micrograph. Through that we call the micrographs. Okay, these are small graphs we call. So we create a outside continuous graph, we accept the request through that, and then request would be passed from the run micrograph component, and we call those respective micrograph, okay, from that. So when we deploy the micrograph, we have to create the micrograph object file. So whenever we deploy the micrograph, there is a mg file is going to be created. So right, we create the micrograph as a simple graph, same like batch graph, but we indicate that in graph settings that this is a micrograph. And also when we deploy the micrograph, there is a command called m underscore deploy micrograph. We are going to understand that command and the detail of that in later part of the sessions, right? So the graph itself is a batch graph, but outside continuous graph is will be called through run micrograph component, and it will be uh, executed. So normally this is used in service oriented architecture. When we call it as SOA architecture, is like transaction processing. So someone initiate the transaction, like someone has to get the detail of the some particular employee. So what we need to do is it will pass the employee ID, and then we received the request from that client side, and then we will the run micrograph is getting called, and it will pass that employee ID, and then batch graph, right? The micrograph will be, maybe it will call the lookup, or it may call another, you know another processing, may request another processing, right? And then it will output the detail of that employee, right? Similarly, web services graph is also, right, request response process system, right? Someone has requested some data, or maybe someone has tried to update some record into the database, right? So what we receive the data is, we will get the full details with employee ID, let's say, and we need to update the uh, transaction detail for a particular employee, right? So we get the transaction detail, also employee ID. Using that employee ID, we will go to that particular transaction. Let's say we want to update the library record for a particular employee, right? So we will get the employee ID from the request, and then using that employee ID and that particular library data, we will go to the particular table and then update that table, and response will be written back. So those kind of service oriented architecture, we will use the micrograph. So why we need micrograph is because these are the so let's talk about batch graphs. Batch graph is very lengthy graphs, and there is a certain time as startup time and shutting down time is also associated with the batch graphs, right? They are huge graphs. So in terms of time, right, so batch graphs takes a lot of time. So that is an overhead, right? So to overcome that overhead, we need a short span running graph, quick running graph, simple, isolated transaction graphs. We need those kind of graphs. So, and if we talk about continuous graph also, because continuous graph is keep on running, right? So even if our services are not requested, even then the continuous graph is keep on running. So we want to avoid both of these: batch graph, startup running time and shutting down time. That overhead, and also in continuous graph, it will running continuously. Therefore, we want to avoid both of these. Therefore, we need the micrograph. So this is the advantage of micrograph, is they are quick running, and we will use a a minimal amount of memory and minimal amount of time to executing this micrograph. Therefore, we need the micrographs. How to set up micrographs? Similarly, like any other graph we create, we will create every processing in that, all those components. But there is a restriction in components basically. Okay, all the foldable components, because it's a single processing, right? So all components within the micrograph has to be foldable, so that my cooperative system will create a single process, right? So I have talked about component folding in my another already YouTube video, so you can watch that. What is component folding, if you don't know? Otherwise, component folding in essence is like it will be a single process. So if all the components are foldable, so the outcome of that, if we enable the component folding, and we are going to utilize that component folding in our batch graph, so that all the components are foldable and it will have a single process. Okay. Restriction on micrograph. I talked about component folding, right? So all the components should be foldable. So I have talked already about all these components, right? So, and there are other restrictions also there, right? So if we talk about database components, right? Let's say talk about one by one. Let's say database components. Okay. So all those components, should be processed in single transaction. There should not be a multiple transaction for a particular within a micrograph. If we want to create a micrograph and we want to use the database component, so we will have to have all those components should be processing it as a single transaction, not multiple transaction. Okay. And file path names, so their path name should be absolute path. It should not be a relative path, like relative in the sense of relative to some other parameter. So all the paths should be absolute path. Okay, when we design the graphs. And the third is like flows and layout. So flows and layout, so flows will be straight flow. Okay, always, straight flows, and serial layout. We will not use the multi-file system over here. Okay. And then there is a so all the component components must be foldable. Whatever components you are using, all should be foldable. And other restriction is like uh, you know graph scripts. So number of times, like we now we have, it's not recommended to use start script and end script in that graphs. So we need to don't use these start and end script. Okay. So in legacy graphs, right? So when we started using a 1.5 and those two version, graph earlier, maybe 10 year, 8 year before. So we used to use the, utilize the start and end script to do the housekeeping, or maybe some initial things which are needs to be done before the graphs run, right? So we want to avoid that. Okay, in these micrographs specifically, there should not be no nesting. Okay, nesting in the sense of we cannot call a micrograph within a micrograph. no nesting. Okay, you should understand that. And then there is a there we cannot have a GD attachment, so we cannot run the full-fledged micrograph in the GDE, right? Then there is an uh, so phase break. Okay, so there could normally we will have single phase. Okay, but if we have to have multiple phase also, but there should not be a checkpoint. No checkpoint, there should not be a checkpoint. There should not be a checkpointed phase. Okay, then run mode you understood, right? Run mode we need to should be micrograph when we design the micrograph. Okay, and the restriction is like uh, so if we want to use the utilize the any let's say lookup we are utilizing in the micrograph, and that lookup is in a multi-file system. So what we can do is we have to use the partitioning component like partition path. Okay, this partition, using this we can create the lookup. Okay, we can call that look this partition and number of partition. There are these are the functions, right? So we can utilize those functions. And so this is today we will talk about only introduction, and in the next videos we are going to see what are the different components we try to use in the micrographs. Okay, and then how to deploy the micrograph and run the micrograph. Okay, and then micrograph transaction, what are the transaction and all, managing the micrographs. There are commands and all, what are the limits, memory limit and the time limit. So I talked about, right? So they are the quick duration and minimum memory utilized, these are the processes, right? So and example of the micrograph. So in three to maybe three videos or four videos maximum, we are trying to do more three more videos, and we will cover everything with respect to micrograph. Okay, thank you so much.